The Art of Listening in Zen. High in the northern mountains of Japan, hidden among whispering winds and the song of pines, there stood a quiet temple. Shrouded in mist and moss, it was known to travelers as the refuge of silence, though the monks who lived there simply called it Kikuin, the hermitage of listening. Within its aged wooden walls lived an old Zen master named Jinin. He didn't teach with lectures or scriptures, he taught through pauses. He never interrupted, he never rushed, he simply listened, and for many that was unsettling. One day, a young man named Kaoru arrived at the temple. His face was restless, his spirit noisy. He was seeking answers. He claimed to have read every book, practiced every method, memorized the teachings of great masters. Yet his heart remained unsettled. "Master Jinin," he said, bowing deeply, "what is the secret to true awakening?" Jinin said nothing. He looked at the young man kindly and turned his attention to the sound of dry leaves rustling outside. The silence stretched like calm water. Kaoru waited, then insisted, "Don't you have anything to say to me?" The old master closed his eyes and gently replied, "If you truly wish to learn, you must first learn how to listen." Kaoru frowned. "But I am listening right now." The master slowly opened his eyes and smiled. "No, young one, you are just waiting for your turn to speak." And in that moment, the wind made itself known, brushing against the temple walls as if it, too, were listening to what had just been said. The teaching had begun. That night, Kaoru was offered a simple room in the outer wing of the temple. No bed, just a woven mat. No clock, no books, no distractions. Only the sound of the wind, the crackle of the hearth in the main hall, and the echo of his own thoughts. He found it unbearable. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loud. Every corner of his mind filled with questions, doubts, memories, regrets. He tossed and turned, then finally gave up and went to find Master Jinin. He found him seated under the moonlight, facing the koi pond, motionless. "Master," Kaoru whispered, "how can I silence my thoughts? I came here for peace, but this quiet is maddening." Jinin didn't turn to him. He simply spoke, as if to the moon. "The mind is like a pond. Throwing stones only stirs the water." Kaoru sat beside him, frustrated. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Again silence. Only the night responded. The soft splash of a fish, the distant hoot of an owl, the cool breath of the wind across the water. And suddenly, Kaoru noticed something. Not in the master, not in the pond, but in himself. He was listening, truly listening, not trying to understand, not trying to judge or answer, just listening, to the pond, to the night, to his own breath. And for a moment, the storm inside quieted. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of stillness. And that, too, was part of the teaching. The next morning, Kaoru joined the monks for their daily routine. Rising before the sun, sweeping fallen leaves, preparing rice, and sitting in meditation before breakfast. No one spoke. It wasn't a rule, just a way of being. The only sounds were the natural rhythms of life. The broom brushing the stone path, water pouring into a bowl, feet shifting on wooden floors. Every action was simple, every gesture intentional. Kaoru tried to follow along, but inside his mind kept racing. During the morning meditation, he sat beside Jinin, struggling to keep his posture, his breath, his attention. Thoughts kept intruding. Is this working? Shouldn't I feel something? What if I'm doing it wrong? Afterward, as they shared rice in silence, Kaoru couldn't take it anymore. He leaned toward the master and whispered, "How do you listen to silence without going mad?" Jinin, still eating, replied softly, "You're not going mad from silence. You're meeting the noise you've carried all your life." Kaoru blinked. He looked down at his bowl. The rice was plain but warm, nourishing, and he understood. Silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything he had refused to face. The silence wasn't the problem. His resistance was, that afternoon he didn't ask questions. He just swept the leaves with the others. The sound of the broom became his teacher. It didn't speak, but it taught. Every rustle said, "Be here." Every pause whispered, "Let go." And Kaoru, for the first time in years, didn't try to find meaning. He just listened. Days passed, each one a mirror of the last. There were no sermons, no dramatic revelations. Just stillness, movement, breath. The temple flowed like a quiet river, carrying Kaoru along whether he resisted or not. In time, he stopped struggling. He stopped asking for answers, and something subtle began to shift. One evening, as the sun melted behind the mountains, Kaoru sat beside Jinin once more. They watched the light dissolve on the surface of the pond, where fallen petals floated like tiny boats adrift. Breaking the silence, Kaoru asked gently, "Master, why don't you speak more?" Jinin smiled without turning his head. "Words are like fingers pointing at the moon. The moment we stare at the finger, we miss the moon." Kaoru looked up. The moon was rising, pale and quiet, as if it had always been listening. The young man nodded slowly. He began to realize, all his life, he had been waiting for the right words, the perfect teaching, the moment of truth to arrive. But the truth had never been absent. It was in the rustle of the leaves, the breath between sentences, the space where nothing is said and everything is heard. Listening wasn't about the ear. It was about presence. And presence was the path. That night, Kaoru returned to his room and sat in silence. Not to fight his thoughts, not to find peace, but simply to listen. To the crickets, to the stillness between their chirps, to his own heart without judgment. And in that listening, he didn't discover answers. He discovered something deeper. He no longer needed them. One early morning, as mist drifted through the pine trees, Kaoru joined the elder monks in the garden. It had become a silent ritual, each tending to the earth, pruning, sweeping, planting, without need for coordination or instruction. They moved as one, not because they spoke, but because they listened to the rhythm of the space, to each other, to the unspoken harmony that filled the garden. While kneeling beside an old monk, Kaoru noticed how the man gently lifted a fallen plum blossom from the soil and placed it on a stone, as if honoring its journey. There was something sacred in that gesture. Kaoru whispered, "Why be so careful with a single flower?" The old monk didn't answer, but his eyes met Kaoru's with such softness that no words were needed. Later, Kaoru asked Jinin about it. The master replied, "When you truly listen, you begin to hear the suffering of all things, but you also begin to hear their beauty. Listening is not passive," he continued. "It is the most active form of compassion." Kaoru's breath caught in his chest. Compassion, he had read about it, tried to practice it, but he had never understood that the first step wasn't doing anything. It was simply being with the sound of someone's pain, being with the silence after their tears, being with your own emptiness, without trying to fill it. That evening, Kaoru walked alone through the forest behind the temple. He didn't bring questions. He didn't expect peace. He simply walked and listened, and the forest, for the first time, spoke. As Kaoru walked deeper into the forest, he noticed how everything made sound, yet nothing seemed to demand attention. The wind didn't shout. The trees didn't argue. Even the stream, bubbling over rocks, sang softly, as if content to be heard only by those who truly listened. He paused by the water's edge and sat on a smooth stone. The current whispered ancient things, not in language, but in rhythm. For the first time in his life, Kaoru felt no urge to speak, not even to himself. His thoughts didn't vanish, but they slowed, softened. They were no longer sharp interruptions, but quiet guests arriving and leaving with the breeze. He remembered something Master Jinin once said, long before Kaoru had arrived. The world is always speaking. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of self in the sound. And now Kaoru understood. His constant interpreting, reacting, labeling had been drowning out the life around him. Even the birds, he realized, had been trying to speak to him every morning. But he hadn't heard them, not really, because he hadn't been there, not fully. That evening, Kaoru returned to the temple and didn't tell anyone what he had realized. He didn't write it down. He didn't meditate on it. He simply lived it. And from that day forward, whenever a monk asked the master, "How can I be more awake?" Master Jinan would point not to the scriptures, not to the altar, but toward Kaoru, quietly sweeping the steps. His movements gentle, his breath slow, his ears open. A student who had learned the most difficult art, not to speak wisely, but to listen deeply. Seasons turned. The plum blossoms fell and returned. Snow arrived quietly, then melted without farewell. The temple changed in small ways, as all living things do. Kaoru remained. He no longer sought to become a master. He no longer needed titles, recognition, or even understanding. Each morning he rose with the sun, tended the garden, swept the paths, and sat in stillness. Not to reach enlightenment, but to listen. One day, a young traveler arrived at the temple, much like Kaoru once had, restless, full of questions, and desperate for clarity. He approached Kaoru, mistaking him for just another monk, and asked, "What must I do to awaken? What is the secret of Zen?" Kaoru looked up from his work, met the young man's eyes, and said nothing. Instead, he handed him a broom. The boy hesitated. "Aren't you going to teach me?" Kaoru smiled gently. "I already am." As they swept together in silence, the boy grew fidgety. "Isn't there more than this?" he asked. Kaoru paused and replied, "You think the silence hides the truth, but the silence is the truth." The boy stared at him, confused. Kaoru didn't explain further. He had learned that real listening didn't require explanation. It required patience, the kind that grows slowly, like moss on stone. And just as the forest had once spoken to Kaoru, the temple would one day whisper to this new seeker, not in words, but in the hush between them. Years later, Kaoru sat alone beneath the great cedar tree at the edge of the temple grounds. His hair had grayed, and his hands bore the lines of work, of seasons lived, of stillness practiced. He had never become abbot. He had never sought to lead. Yet when visitors came, they were often drawn to him, not because he spoke, but because they felt heard, even in his silence. One afternoon, as a soft rain fell and clouds gathered like monks in prayer, a young novice sat beside him and asked, "Master Kaoru, how do I know when I am truly listening?" Kaoru didn't answer immediately. He let the sound of rain speak first. Then, slowly, he replied, "When you no longer need to respond, when you are not waiting to be wise, when the silence feels full instead of empty, then you are listening." The novice nodded, unsure if he understood, but sensing that something sacred had passed between them. Kaoru closed his eyes. He thought of the path that had brought him here. The frustration, the questions, the wind through the trees, the quiet meals, the sweeping, the endless practice of presence. No single moment had changed him. It had all changed him, not by adding knowledge, but by peeling it away. What remained was not a man full of teachings, but a man who had learned to make space. For others, for life, for the voice of things too quiet to be heard by ears alone. As the rain continued to fall, the novice stayed at his side. Neither spoke, and that, Kaoru thought, was the greatest teaching he could ever give. Not a phrase, not a lesson, just this, a shared silence, a presence that listens, and a heart wide enough to hold it all.